I'm a research analyst and the project coordinator at Center of Pakistan and International Relations. My research interests are national security, military modernization, and implications of emerging technologies like cyberspace, artificial intelligence, and data analytics on the individual, national, and international security. So a brief about our team, and it is, as you can see on the screen, Miss Amna Malik is the president of the Center of Pakistan International Relations. Khalid Latif is the advisor for the Center on International Affairs. I'm the project coordinator, and we also have Syed Mushahid with us, who's a research associate. So moving on towards the rationale of today's conference. As you can see on your screens, that Semantic ranked Pakistan among the top 10 most targeted destinations of the cyber threats. Pakistan ranked 67th on the Global Security Index. Over 150 million cellular subscribers and 6 million broadband internet users in Pakistan. Pakistan is vulnerable to the cyber threats. Talking about digital economy, which is, the zeitgeist of the times. Pakistan's small and medium enterprises comprises 90% of all the enterprises which are vulnerable and defenseless to the cyber threats. The lack of information and cybersecurity awareness and the persistent information threats and the security cultures. In a couple of months ago, in August 2020, the senior officials of the Pakistan, including some very senior military bureaucrats, suffered from an information hack led by India. So in the context of national security, as we will be talking about the individual security and national security today, Pakistan is facing an imminent threat from the India. India have a preemptive military posture. India is revolutionizing its military and its intelligence affairs, which is a threat for Pakistan. India is establishing national cybersecurity policy in 2013, and it have announced that the country will formulate a cyber command in 2019, which it didn't, but it will soon. India also announced to initiate cyber command in the future. It have, far-fetched relations with the Israel, USA, and Russia, all the countries having, strong cybersecurity strategies. So objective of our today's webinar will be to discuss, prioritize, and propose the policy recommendations for securing the cyberspace of Pakistan. We will identify the areas of concern and conflict between a nation state and citizens on the subject of cybersecurity. We will recognize the application of cyberspace as an instrument to curb hostilities spread by nation states as well as antagonist actors. We will assess the capacity and challenges developing countries face in the adoption, operation, and organization of these emerging technologies in the national security. We will also encourage the academic circles for ruminating on the incorporation of cybersecurity in the curriculum of national security and strategic studies. And finally, we would like to advocate effective policies for the defense and national security, keeping in mind the challenges and threats emerging from the nascent domains like cyberspace. So we are having almost 7 speakers today. There will be a comparative analysis of the Australia's, China's, and USA's cyber policies. The technical experts will shed light on the critical infrastructures, threat management, and capacity building. The policymakers will be discussing the human rights, the societal stability, and the national orientation. So the format of our today's session will be that each speaker will be given 10 minutes for his or her speech after their introduction, and it will be followed by a 5 minutes question and answer session. First few speakers will shed light on the comparative analysis of the technologically advanced countries. Then we will move on to the policy orientation and capacity building in the domain of cyberspace. And lastly, we will focus on the implications of cyberspace for human rights. In the end, the president of the Center of Pakistan International Relations, Ms. Amna Malik, will deliver her concluding remarks. So, starting our today's session, First of all, I would like to introduce Mr. Paul Rosenweig. He's the Senior Resident Fellow at National Security and Cybersecurity R Street in USA. He works on legal and policy issues related to the cybersecurity, national security, and tech policy, including the intersection of privacy and security. In addition to his work at R Street, Paul manages a cybersecurity consulting company called the Red Branch Consulting and teaches at the George Washington University School of Law. Previously, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the US Department of Homeland Security. Paul is also the author of a book called Cyber Warfare: How Conflicts in Cyberspace Are Challenging America and Changing the World. Mr. Paul's title of speech today will be Defending Forward and Persistent Engagement, America's Cyber Strategy. A very warm welcome to Mr. Paul Rosenweig. Sir, the stage is yours now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Siddiqui. I appreciate very much the opportunity to join you today. It's really quite an honor for me to be invited to speak with you. Good morning from Washington, D.C. Good evening in Pakistan. My topic today is America's cyber strategy, defend forward and persistent engagement. That strategy derives from a paradox. The paradox is that the United States has greater cyber capacity and capability than almost any other nation in the world. Perhaps it is preeminent, but it is certainly in the top ranks in terms of our capabilities and capacities to execute in the cyber domain, both commercially and as a government, offensively and defensively. Yet paradoxically, despite this seeming preeminence, the United States has, over the past decade and a half, suffered systematic vulnerabilities to cyber intrusions and attacks of one form or another. Our most secure database of security passage was hacked by the Chinese out of our Office of Personnel Management. One of our largest media companies, Sony, was nearly destroyed by North Korean hackers. US banks were subject to persistent attack from Iran. We've suffered a significant systematic theft of intellectual property from China. And of course, most recently in 2016, public reports suggested there was substantial, significant interference in the US elections by Russians, Russian-sponsored hackers. So the question is, why? How is it that a country with so much capability as the United States has could nonetheless be systematically so vulnerable to cyber attack from adversarial powers, whether they are state actors or in some case non-state actors? And the answer, after some analysis, we came to conclude lay in what we call here the escalation problem. America has a vast series of networks that are difficult, if not impossible, to defend completely. That makes America what we've come to describe as asymmetrically vulnerable to cyber attack from outside of our borders. Other nations therefore have what we might characterize, if we were talking about this in an international relations perspective and relating it back to the nuclear nuclear missile stage, escalation dominance. In other words, if we were, for example, to have responded to Russian election interference, there was a fear in the United States that our financial industry, for example, would be vulnerable to a countervailing attack from Russia. And so rather than being able to respond, the United States was stuck and remained stuck strategically with a series of relatively ineffective countermeasures. We engaged in a naming and shaming campaign against China that simply called it out for its intellectual property theft. And we, for example, put in what I think most of the world would say are ineffective sanctions against the North Koreans for the Sony hack. So where does that leave us? The bottom line is that as we make the turn into 2016 post-election, the US had no effective deterrence model at all for its cyber strategy, and in effect, no strategy whatsoever. which leads us to the development of our current new strategy instituted in 2018 by US Cyber Command, which goes by the name of Defend Forward and Persistent Engagement. Defend Forward is a defensive strategy that is intended to disrupt malicious actions at its source. So it's not a deterrence by denial, protection, and it's not a deterrence by countervailing force, that is threats to others, but rather the idea of getting inside of the enemy's decision loop, if you will, and disrupting his actions before they occur. This is designed to include military activity that is below the threshold of what we would traditionally consider armed conflict. It is intended to be forward positioned, both geographically with US military troops acting overseas, and more importantly, defending virtually in other people's networks outside the borders of the United States. It's intended to be proactive. It is said to be intended to observe, pursue, and then counter the cyber operations of our adversaries before they occur. And it necessarily involves US cyber operations in the physical territories of other nations. The most recent example that has been publicly disclosed is efforts by US Cyber Command to disrupt a ransomware bot known as the TrickBot network that involved activities both domestically and overseas. The second component of this is to realize that in the cyber domain, we must act persistently. That is, unlike in the physical domain, where a conflict begins and ends in a fixed period of time, typically, this conflict is ongoing at all times. And so our efforts in the United States, we say, are designed to identify threats on a persistent basis, on a continuous basis at all times. The third aspect of this policy that bears noting is that it is not a secret policy. It is a declaratory policy that has been publicly announced by the US government and US Cyber Command. As such, it is an effort to put other nations on notice that this is how the United States intends to proceed in response to the perceived threats to its own national interests. Now, the last point I would make before I close and offer to answer questions is that this policy is avowedly a self-defense policy. It is denominated Defend Forward by the United States and is intended to be used only in defense of our own national interests. I have to confess, even as an American analyst, that I'm not sure that that's exactly how it looks from the perspective of our foreign interlocutors. If I were living in Pakistan or in Russia or in China, America Defend Forward would look very much to me like US government in my networks. And that would, even though it was avowedly declared to be a defensive policy, have echoes of an offensive nature that are new and different, both in terms of the operational policy of the US government, in terms of the operational policy of nations around the world, in terms of global cyber norms, and in terms of international law. And with that, I will offer to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for sharing your shrewd insight. Yes, Ms. Zoe, your question first.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Siddiq, I interrupted you. I just had a quick question. Do you think that the declarative nature of the policy is a hindrance to its effectivity just because people are aware of what we're doing?
Well, that's a great question. Traditionally, the United States has believed that declaratory policies are more effective because we say what we mean and we mean what we say, and by doing so, we can effectively draw red lines. But typically, in the past, those declaratory policies have involved technologies and capabilities that are not degraded by public exposure. Declaring your nuclear retaliation declaratory policy doesn't change your ability to launch nuclear missiles. That's different in this domain. And so there is indeed a serious concern that by speaking about our activity in this space, the United States is reducing its capability. I am aware that that very question was the subject of very serious and heated discussions within government before it was decided to make this policy public and declaratory. The only answer I can give you, Ms. Dabbs, is that we're engaged in an ongoing social experiment. And we may very well find out that that the US government has made a mistake. It's not yet determined whether or not that's the case. And we may have degraded our capability more than the benefits we gain. But that's a predictive judgment that others have made as well. And I'm not capable of negating what they say.
Yeah, hindsight is always 2020.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Mr. Paul,
Yes.
talking about the persistent engagement, an article was published last month in the Foreign Policy. It was, I guess, of the Paul Nuckenson. It stated that in the cyber realm, offense is the best defense. What is your comment?
Well, that is the nature of Defend Forward. General Nakasone is the commander of US Cyber Command. And so he commands the American cyber troops that are responsible for implementing Defend Forward. And in saying that offense is the best defense, I think first off, he's stating a truism, which is that in the cyber domain where we are working, defense is very, very difficult, if not impossible, for your highest value assets. A persistent adversary will eventually succeed in disrupting your network. And so the only effective counter strategy that we've been able to develop so far is to hold at risk the offensive capabilities of adversaries overseas. And that means exercising offensive capabilities, albeit in a defensive, in the service of defense. As I said in the talk, there's a very fine line between exercising your offensive capabilities for defensive purposes, which is what the US declaratory policy is, and exercising those same offensive capabilities for offensive purposes, which is how some outside of the United States may very well perceive America's new policy. And the American policy is a response, as I said at the beginning, to the unfortunate strategic reality that we've got an asymmetric vulnerability going on. So it's pretty much what we have to do if we're going to be effective at all. But we are doing so, I think, with eyes wide open as to the likely skepticism with which that might be met overseas.
So, Mr. Hari Khan, I have a quick question.
Yes, good morning from here in Florida. It's for is it Dr. Rosenwig or is just Mr. Rosenwig? What is it?
I do not have a PhD, so I'm not a doctor.
All right. I consider PhD as, I live here in the University of Florida. There are one too many PhDs. And when I completed a master's a while back, one of my advisors actually told me, do you intend to get a job as a Pizza Hut delivery driver? And I said,
I like that.
Why is it? All right, I would like your views. You kept on using the declarative policy of the United States in which you said it was defensive/offensive. Now, going back to the Bush doctrine, which was based on preemption, are there a lot of, again, unclassified, are there a lot of preemptions, knowing that there's the enemy over there and United States with its allies and partners does get involved in preemptions?
Well, that's a great question. Part of the answer to that is that I can't really say, because much of this is behind classified, a classified cloak, and much of it I'm personally unaware of since I've been out of government for a number of years. There have been several public reports of what I think would fairly be characterized as preemptive activity by US Cyber Command in service of this new policy. The most prominent publicly reported such activity involved operations against Russian networks in the run-up to and execution of America's 2018 midterm elections, fearing a reprise of the Russian disinformation and disruption campaigns of 2016, US Cyber Command undertook and has publicly reported on a series of actions it took that were essentially offensive in nature, in the sense of taking adversaries offline and disrupting their communications activity, but were intended preemptively to prevent reciprocal Russian activity that was anticipated in respect of the 2018 election. So I think the answer is yes, that defend forward and persistent engagement have a component of preemption to them, of necessity in the cyber domain, where responding after this disruption to your own networks is typically too late to have any positive value for your own self-defense. I would almost be willing to say that by its nature, active cyber defenses have to be preemptive to some degree. The question is whether they're preemptive by an hour, a day, a week, or a year.
Thank you.
So a last question. I need a brief answer from you, Mr. Paul. It is about what is the implications of this, persistent engagement on the individual security and the civil liberties?
Well, if any military targeting necessarily implicates the civil liberties and civil rights of those who are targeted, if the targeting is in error. Obviously, under international law, if the targeting is accurate, then the conflict that you're engaged in makes the target a permissible one. The possibility of false positives, adverse action against people who ought not to be targeted is a real one, as it is in any action by any military in any conflict, whether it's kinetic or virtual. We have yet to see significant incorrect military targeting in the cyber domain, at least that's been publicly declared, certainly less so than in the kinetic domain. But that's certainly a cautionary note that we're going to have to keep in mind going forward and be aware of.
Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Paul. We will move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ms. Anusha Mushtaq. She's a presenter at Australian National University. She works in the management capacity at Australian Defence IT projects, especially related to the cybersecurity. Ms. Anusha has an extensive experience in working with the Australian public and private sector organizations within the information and communication technology sector. She's an accomplished public speaker and regularly invited to speak at the national security conferences on the topics of counter-violent extremism and social media extremism and terrorist online recruitment strategies. She publishes regularly in the Australian security magazines, and she's an associate member of the Australian Institute of Professional Intelligence Officers. So being an integral part of the Australian Defence IT projects related to the cybersecurity, of course, Ms. Anusha will be enlightening us about the Australia's cyber strategy. So Ms. Anusha, please.
Thank you, Mr. Siddiqui, for inviting me to present on Australia's cybersecurity strategy. In June this year, the Australian government released Australia's Cybersecurity Strategy 2020. The strategy is an update of the previous Cybersecurity Strategy 2016. It is largely a continuation of the work commenced under the 2016 strategy and addresses themes common across many national cybersecurity strategies. The updated strategy continues most of the focus areas from the 2016 strategy, but is notable for more directly calling out state actors and state-sponsored adversaries, and for a significant change in approach to protect national critical infrastructure. The strategy allows almost 3 times more funding per annum than the previous 2016 strategy. It also calls for rapid expansion of personnel in the nation's cybersecurity agencies and identifies a new regulatory regime to enforce cybersecurity standards for public and private sector providers of national critical infrastructure. Having been finalized and released during the COVID-19 pandemic, the strategy uses the rapid expansion of alternative working arrangements and the resulting increase in online activities to illustrate and make the case that government must increase its efforts to ensure the safety of citizens online, just as they work to provide a safe and secure physical environment. Based on the 2016 cybersecurity strategy, the Australian government established Australian Cybersecurity Centre, established the Joint Cybersecurity Centres to engage state and territory governments and industry, increasing cyber skills and education investments. Also, they established the 24/7 Global Watch, appointing the Ambassador for Cybersecurity, established the Australian Cyber Security Growth Network, and Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the evolving nature of cyber threats. Opportunistic cybercriminals quickly adapted their methods to take advantage of more Australians working, studying, and connecting online. Between 10th and 26th of March this year, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre received over 45 pandemic-themed cybercrime and cybersecurity incident reports of COVID-19 themed scams. Campaigns were designed to distribute malicious software like malware or harvest personal and financial information from unsuspecting Australians. In the strategy, it is stated that the partnerships between governments, businesses, and communities are important in ensuring Australia is cyber secure. We are living in a digital world. We are regularly communicating and connected with our colleagues, friends, and families via various social media platforms like Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and more. However, as the digital space has increased, so have the cyber threats. Cyber criminals' aim is to infiltrate IT systems from anywhere in the world. Nation-state and state-sponsored actors seek to compromise networks to obtain economic, policy, legal, defense, and security information for their advantage. These actors tend to be sophisticated and well-resourced, whose actions could impact Australia's national security and economic prosperity. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre has worked closely with Australia's major telecommunication providers and web browser companies, Google and Microsoft, to disrupt the foreign criminals. These actions include flagging websites as malicious at the web browser level and blocking them from phone users. We also need to keep in mind that human behavior is almost always part of the problem. most cybersecurity incidents have an element of human error. This means it is critical that all Australians know how to stay secure online. The online safety includes protecting individuals, families, and communities from harmful content and behaviors such as cyberbullying. The eSafety Commissioner has been established in Australia as the main point of contact for the public online safety. It is important that we as professional academics, policymakers, researchers, and IT specialists must educate our communities, families, and friends on the risks associated with devices connected to the digital world. Globally, we must combine efforts to protect our societies from cyber criminals. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anushi. My first question will be that what do you suggest for the Pakistan, as we are in a very nascent and developing stage? Pakistan have developed its cyber law a couple of years ago, but we do not have comprehensive framework for the national cybersecurity, or for securing the national cyberspace. It includes the security of the individuals, their freedom of speech, along with the security of the national cyberspace. Like, our cyberspace is vulnerable to the external threats. Pakistan have been ranked as the 7th most vulnerable country. What do you suggest? What should be the starting point for the country to develop its national cyber strategy?
Yeah, so Australia started as a way that there are different government agencies. To start with, like the Department of Defence, but within Department of Defence, we've got ASD, which is the Australian Signals Directorate, which is the intelligence and cybersecurity arm. Also, recently, as I mentioned, in 2016, they actually created Australian Cybersecurity Centre. And the reason for creating Australian Cybersecurity Centre was to combine the threat analysis or the threat feeds, which a lot of other agencies get. For example, like ASIO, which is an intelligence organization, or Australian Federal Police, or Attorney General's Department. Previously, what was happening, they were just having their own threats and they were analyzing that. So it wasn't a combined effort. So this has really created a holistic view for Australia, how we can share the threat analysis. Also, Australia works a lot with the Five Eyes, for example, USA, France, and other countries, to share that threat analysis. And what that means, before it strikes another country, the threat is analyzed and we can action on that. From the Pakistan's point of view, I think it's a very simple thing. So I've been working in IT in the cybersecurity space for a long time. And I can present examples where, as simple as not having a secure password on your firewalls, or, for example, not having a secure password on your laptop can actually really affect an organization. And I'm talking about government departments where I worked in a specific project where it was a very serious government department. But when we investigated, it was as simple as, they had a firewall and the password was password. So I think we really need to think about educating people. So education is the key. And as I mentioned, that Australia has established eSafety Commissioner, and that is for general public. So parents can view what is online safety, what is their kids viewing. I mean, kids these days, from 5 years old, they have got iPads or iPhones. But what is safety? What is online safety is the key, because the new generation, which is coming out in all around the world, or even in Pakistan, will have all sorts of devices. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let's move on to our next speaker. We have Ms. Zoe Dabbs with us. She is the Insider Threat Analyst at Insider Threat Management Group, ITMG. Ms. Zoe Dabbs have a professional research background in national security, politics, and foreign affairs with a regional concentration in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. In her current role, she supports the insider threat management for a Fortune 5 company. She identifies the intelligence gaps and processes for improvement in the threat model. She received her master's degree in politics and security from University College London School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies. Being a cyber threat analyst, Ms. Dabbs will talk about mitigating insider threat in implementing cyber security policy. Welcome, Ms. Zoe. The forum is yours now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sadiq. And I just wanted to thank all the panelists for having me here with you as well. I want to acknowledge that I'm breathing rarefied air. So thank you very much. I actually have a deck for you guys today. Let me just share. It keeps me on track when I want to go off on tangents. My dad calls it the gift of the gab, and my grandmother calls it talking too much. So here we go. Right, so based on my background, where I'm coming from, I'm going to discuss mitigating insider threat through cybersecurity policy and not just practices. When Daniel Ellsberg copied and exfiltrated the Pentagon Papers in 1969, he just used a photocopier and brought the pages out in boxes. And Americans' understanding of that at the time was more based in treason and espionage. The concept of insider threat wasn't really part of the public lexicon. But when Edward Snowden stole classified information from the NSA, he brought it out on a thumb drive the size of your finger. So it's no coincidence that our concept of insider threat has evolved dramatically in the past few decades. That's coincided with the rapid evolution of the cyber landscape. Because insider threat is such a relatively new concept for corporations and governments, it has only recently been acknowledged for what it is holistically. It's not just the threat of nefarious activity from disgruntled or fortune-seeking employees. It also includes the threat, as Ms. Mushtaq said, of clicking a random link that you shouldn't, or not being trained to understand when someone is trying to elicit sensitive information for you. So in regards to that, we dub that unintentional insider threat, or UIT, which the acts of careless employees pose the greatest insider risk to an organization or company. Carnegie Mellon's CERT study showed that 40% of the participants surveyed, their greatest fear for their organization was that a careless employee would do something to compromise their network. And in fact, 50% of data breaches are due to UIT, unintentional insider threat. In order to mitigate the risk of insider threat, it's necessary to understand the difference between malicious and unintentional. And with that knowledge, it's possible to target the major gaps in an institution's or government cyber program. Committed with malintent, malicious insider threat is pretty self-explanatory, and it's the most dramatic, and for lack of a better word, the sexiest version of insider threat, but it should be the least concerning for governments in terms of protecting their infrastructures from their own employees. Unintentional threat occurs when a current or former employee who has had or has authorized access to an organization's network, system, or data, who through action or inaction without malicious intent causes harm or substantially increases the probability of serious harm in the future. The majority of security compromise due to insider threat is UIT, and they're short for should be elevated in the consideration of securing cyber networks during the policymaking process. So UIT can be broken down into 4 separate categories. You have DISC, which is an accidental disclosure over the internet of sensitive information. You have UIT hack, which is when a malicious outsider is accidentally granted access through malicious code, social engineering, or an unauthorized device. You have fizz, which is simply when people dispose of physical documents incorrectly, and port, which is when security is compromised due to loss of device product. So disk and hack insider threats can be addressed primarily through improved organizational cyber training and implementation of cautionary monitoring and data tools. Fizz and port, usually we address those through improved protocols and bolstered organizational policy. So the causes of UIT, there are dozens if you want to break them out really small, but they fall under three main umbrellas, which is human error, organizational practices, and a weak cyber infrastructure. Each cause has a clear and distinct mitigation strategy that works in tandem with the others in order to reduce the overall risk of UIT. So human error, it's mostly about training. Mitigating human error requires enhanced awareness training for all employees who routinely use devices and access networks. This should include reviewing phishing scams and social media threat vectors, as well as how to handle data properly and what is sensitive data, because a lot of employees don't tend to have that level of awareness. The next is organizational practices should be revised to include a hands-on aspect to train employees how to properly use security tools. So activate VPNs, update the patches on their computers, etc. This training should be initiated by management and executed from the top down, and leadership should dictate best practices, company culture of data handling protocols, device security, and workflow. In addition to ensure employees are functioning at their highest levels, management should also streamline workflows and adjust deadlines to mitigate human error caused by fatigue, excessive workload, minimal time off. And finally, in order to provide a safety net, so to speak, for human error that will inevitably occur, even with training and modified organizational practices, we need to make sure that organizational cyber infrastructure is enhanced. So that should include defense tools such as software that recognizes phishing emails, prevents data loss, monitors potential data loss, and detects malicious websites. Organizations need to make sure that they invest in the security of their firewalls, their antivirus software, their anti-malware, in addition to enabling remote wipe access for all devices. So in order to properly mitigate unintentional insider threat on a national level, these strategies should be incorporated into policy, not just recommended to an organization or company operating within the country. So my policy recommendations. Cybersecurity for developing countries with fledgling programs needs to account for insider threat in the policy creation process. Addressing the causes of UIT with policy or mandated mitigation strategies, tools, and protocols for all organizations in the country will create a program that is much less susceptible to UIT. Policy needs to distinguish between malicious threat and non-malicious threat. So it needs to provide clear, fair, and just legal reinforcements that match both intentional and inadvertent violations of policy. So if the wording of a policy is too vague or the punishment is too severe, the potential for non-compliance goes up. So the severity of the policy, and if the enforcement is too stringent, that creates a distrust of and paranoia towards the government, because the organizations attempting to comply with policy might be penalized for unintentional violation of it. So failing to establish reasonable and just consequences for unintentional compromise of a nation's cyber initiative will create conflict between a nation and its population. Finally, agencies and organizations should be mandated to provide requirements for both corporations and government organizations in terms of organizational training, tool and infrastructure requirements, and routine employee awareness and practical training. Given that this understanding of insider threat is a relatively new concept in cyber and national security, there's not really a precedent for incorporating UIT mitigation strategies in national cybersecurity policies. So in order to address this crucial area of risk, countries with fledgling cybersecurity programs must give the proper weight to UIT in all initial policymaking processes. If it's not incorporated into the foundational cybersecurity policy, it won't be intrinsic, and therefore it'll be less effective than if it was built in from the ground up. The internal threat to a country's cyber initiative is just as important and consequential as any external threat. And policymakers need to consider this to ensure the effectiveness of any cyber program. I welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dabbs. So I'll be asking you about what are the legal ramifications, like in the USA, for an insider revealing or exhuming the information from a public or a private sector company?
The legal ramifications vary depending on the corporation, the department, the branch of government. So I don't have a catch-all answer for you. However, I can say that in tandem with any policies that are executed, there does need to be a legal component and a legal consultation. That is, I know that personally my contact with my legal department is almost hourly. So I would recommend that, again, while I don't have a catch-all answer for what the legal ramifications are, because they vary based pretty much even which region you're in and what type of organization you work for, I would recommend that a policy is created in tandem with a law. So cyber policy in tandem with a cyber law.
All right, got your point. So Mr. Hari, yeah, please proceed.
Is it me?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Mr. Haris Khan, you have a question.
Yes, I have one question for Ms. Dabbs. You said 90% of the threats go undetected. So
Yes.
when they do detect those 90%, do they actually assess that these are kind of a benign, let them go, or they have a particular protocol? Okay, within this 90%, we will cherry pick as to which is a bigger threat that we have to deal with.
I'm not quite sure I can answer your question, just because the 90% that go undetected, that is an estimate based on a study that was done given retroactive examination of insider threat risk that was realized after the fact. So in terms of the nature of those incidents, I can't really speak to what we considered high level or low level. What I do know is that a large majority of things that could be considered insider threat, like data egress that might be sensitive, or IP sharing, the systems that detect those things aren't perfect, and the tools that we use, we are constantly tuning. So what I would say is that at the initial start of any insider threat program, you're going to have a lot of false positives. So you're going to have a lot of triggers and a lot of alerts that come up that they don't necessarily need to, but that informs our refinement of the threat model process and gives us a larger net to realize what we're losing.
Thank you.
I have a question now.
Yeah, of course.
Dabbs. Yeah, great discussion, because I was actually going to present on insider threat. It's one of my favorite topics.
I'm so happy you didn't, because I got to.
Yeah,
I would have been shamed.
So I've been working with the government departments and defense for a long time. So in
Yeah.
Australia, they actually implement software to actually monitor some of the activities. And I won't name the softwares, but it is really interesting what you can see, what people are doing, and especially, as you mentioned, like simple things like USBs. So defense is actually banned because it's got different security networks,
Yeah.
especially on the DRN, which is the defense restricted networks and defense secure networks. There's actually no USBs allowed ever. So
We learned our lesson after Snowden, right?
yeah. So I mean, that's one of the key things which the government looks for, and it is pretty obvious to the employees that yes, they are being observed. So is that the same case with US?
I would say, again, NSA completely has banned USBs, for obvious reasons. I'm not sure how uniform the banning is, but I would assume that at least our intelligence organizations and our military branches ban those things. I know that when you go into the NSA, they don't even let you take your phone. So
yeah, that's the same with us.
yeah. And I know that the organization I contract for, we banned USB devices a year ago. So I think that the banning of USB devices in companies that deal with either like large profit and proprietary information and organizations, either government or private, that deal with matters of national security are definitely USB banning. And given that progression, I would assume that it would probably become government-wide in maybe a decade.
Yeah, I mean, we are following the same, and as I mentioned, that Australia collaborates very well with USA on threat intelligence, and it's been there for a while. But I think also, like as you're mentioning, not having any phones, can't take phones inside. Sometimes it's only paper and pencil,
Yeah.
depending on where you're going.
All analog.
Yeah, that's right. But thank you so much. It was a great presentation.
Thank you very much. It means a lot coming from you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Zoe. So the president of Center of Pakistan and International Relations is also online. She was, viewing your talk, Ms. Zoe. Moving on to our next speaker, we have Mr. Francisco Fonseca. He is the Vice President at National Cybersecurity at BitSite. Mr. Fonseca co-founded Anubis Networks in 2016. Prior to his initiative, he founded an IT company called Crashless, specializing in complex Microsoft-based integration services. While working for the Vodafone, he was granted prestigious award for the Microsoft Exchange Most Valuable Professional consecutively for 3 years in 2003, 2004, and 2005. Mr. Fonseca holds a degree in management and computer sciences from Minho University and taught computer networks at Nova University and Moderna University. So he's a senior technical expert on cybersecurity, and today he will be sharing his shrewd insight on understanding the cybersecurity posture of critical infrastructure through a technical approach. So the forum is yours now, sir.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Siddiq. So my name is Francisco Fonseca, as you know, and I'm responsible for the National Cybersecurity area at BitSite. In that area, what we do is working with countries in order to help them monitoring the national critical infrastructure. We currently have 38 countries working with us, and today I'll be sharing with you what we are doing with those countries. First of all, a quick explanation about what the rating is, because this will be important. So the rating is a number we provide to any organization in the world, private, governmental. It's a number that goes from 250 to 900, where 250 means basic security posture, 900 means advanced security posture. So the higher, the better. This rating is calculated based on information that exists around the world. It's non-intrusive, so we don't need to deploy any software nor any hardware on the organizations, and it's continuous, like the stock market. So every day there's a new rating, and it's based on objective data. It's not based on questionnaires, perceptions I've heard, so it's objective data. The interesting part of the rating is that allows anyone to talk cybersecurity. So non-experts, everyone will understand the rating. Now, how is this rating calculated? The rating is calculated using information. So we use 120 different data sources. And then there's an important part, which is the mapping of the organization. So that we can attribute events and information we see around the world to specific organizations, in this case to critical infrastructure, we need to know their external infrastructure. So we have a significant amount of people and algorithms that will try to find out what is the external networks, IP addresses, and domains that those organizations have. So nowadays we have currently more than 200,000 organizations mapped around the world. So in most of the countries, we already have some thousands of organizations. And that's very important because it's when we see data, we can then relate that data to bank A, electric company B, transportation company C, etc. This part is absolutely critical. And this is what allows us to be a ratings company. Then for each organization, we'll look 23 risk vectors. In a few moments, I'll show them. So I'm not going to talk right now in detail. And finally, the rating is calculated. So every day, a country has the capability on a daily basis to know the risk, the security risk that a critical infrastructure represents. Just a high-level view. This is an example of the information that they will be able to see. If we look into the screen, what this tells us, this is data from an electric company in Brazil. So what this data tells us, and this is what is available on a daily basis, is for instance that if we see this this blue bar here, this is where typically electric companies should be around the world. In this case, although this electric company is improving, it's still below. So in terms of risk, represents a higher risk than the standard in the industry. We can also, those are the 23 risk vectors I mentioned a few moments ago, and we provide a grade for each risk vector. So we can tell for each critical infrastructure how they are performing on a specific vector. For instance, as we know, email is still one of the main attack vectors. We will tell how the organization is performing in terms of SPF and DKIM, how they certificate, how they manage the firewalls, open ports, etc. A means that they are on the top 10%, and F would mean they are on the bottom 20%. We also tell what's their time to respond to security incidents. We can say what is the norm, what we see in each industry, what we see on that specific organization so that they can benchmark their times to respond to incidents. And also the diligence part. So if we look at all the diligence part is typically related with best practices, configurations. We'll tell how that critical infrastructure is performing when we compare with the industry, so that we know that that organization is performing worse or better than what is expected on what we see around the world. Now, how are we working with governmental agencies in order to make this happen? We typically work at 3 levels: strategical, sectoral, and operational. I'm going to share with you some examples of what we do on the strategical and sectoral, because I think those are the most interesting. At strategic level, we are talking about the directors or the head of the national cybersecurity centers or national certs. Some of the challenges they have is communicating to a politician. So they need to communicate the cybersecurity of the critical infrastructure. And it's not easy, as we all here in this call know, to talk security to non-technical people. They also need to talk to media, for instance, to the media more and more, because the media is demanding more information around this area. They need to talk sometimes with executives of the constituents, right? And one of their main responsibilities is to generate awareness among those persons. And also they want to benchmarking their nations and their industry. So one person with this role responsibility, they want to know how the finance sector in my country is performing, comparing with the other finance sectors of my neighbors or a country I want to do benchmarking with. How is my country performing against other countries? From a sectoral perspective, and sectoral, I mean, in this type of organizations, in general, we see sector people that someone that is responsible for the sector. So those agencies may have someone that will interact with the finance institutions, someone that will interact with the energy institutions, with transportation, etc. And it's important that those persons have the capability to have good conversations with the constituents. And if we can provide that information in advance, those conversations will be more productive. At least they can focus on the risk, where the risk is and exists. Imagine it's like going to a doctor, and before you have the first conversation, the doctor has access to your blood analysis. Then, measuring the performance of those CNI, how they are performing a specific, let's say, electric company compared to the other 100 electric companies in the world that are more similar to that one in terms of size of infrastructure, amount of employees. So we can tell how they are performing, comparing with companies that are exactly the same or very similar. Incentivizing improvement and generating awareness. We have the capability to show how the companies are performing in a specific sector. And that is used in order to incentivize improvement. It's part, if we are responsible for an organization and someone from the government tell us, look, your organization stands here, from a national perspective, you are one of the top performers or one of the worst performers. Typically what we see is that the ones that are on the bottom will work extremely hard in order to improve, right? So, and finally, we have this collaboration part where the government can collaborate with the critical infrastructure, providing them access to the platform. Now, in terms of the last part of my presentation, I would like to share with you some examples around how those governmental agencies are measuring the security performance, the cybersecurity performance, in this case, of those organizations. And I'm going to share with you some examples. I think they are interesting because, again, in this area, it's difficult to communicate, to measure, and we try to make it in a way that we try to make it more easier. So one example is we can show the trends during the previous 12 months of all the critical infrastructure. In this example here, for instance, the usefulness of this slide will be to tell us which CNIs we should be focusing. The ones probably that presents a higher risk today, or the ones that have a trend to go down, where the risk is increasing. Another example, we have the capability to say how the different critical infrastructure performed in the previous 12 months. In this example, we see we are measuring different critical infrastructure. We have the rating, and then we have the delta. So we can see in the previous year, which ones performed better, which ones performed not so well. And finally, imagine the capability on a quarterly basis to see the progress or the absence of progress. In this case, we can see that this country is performing well because 1 year ago, let's say they had 10 organizations in low risk, 6 in high risk. 1 year later, we can see that they have now 12 in low risk and 3 in high risk. So they were able to reduce 6 companies in high risk into 3, and that's progress. This slide is one example how in some countries they will be communicating with politicians to explain and justify the investments that are being done in a way that they will understand. We are not talking about firmware upgrades, TLS. We are talking a language that they will understand. Another approach is comparing how the different ministries, for instance, this can be done, and it's done for each sector, but how the different ministries are performing comparing with the average of the ministries around the world. So we know that average of the ministries around the world is 650. You can tell which ones are performing better. So then you can, again, prioritize. And when you put those variables on a matrix where you can measure the performance in the previous 12 months, how they compare with what is expected on a specific industry, you can have probably an interesting picture about which CNIs you should be focusing and prioritizing. In this case, being at the top right quadrant is a good place to be. It means that this organization is above the average of the sector, and last 12 months they performed well. Being on the bottom left side means that they are not performing so well. So imagine having the capability to have this picture for each sector will probably help someone that needs to make decisions in terms of prioritizing the investments, to measure the performance over time, et cetera, et cetera. And with this, I finish my presentation. So and I'm open for questions.
Yes, Mr. Fonseca, thank you for your presentation. As you know that Pakistan is a nuclear deterrent nation. Nuclear installations are always the critical infrastructure you talked about. Our country have collaborated with the United States and adopted the best practices, the trainings and the personal screening, in increasing its nuclear safety or the cybersecurity of its nuclear installations. So, but yet there has been an article in the arms control which highlighted that Pakistan can and should do more to provide confidence that the international community that the nuclear program employs the highest level of the safety and security. So what are your thoughts on this, that what should be the roadmap or the strategy for the Pakistan to enhance its safety and security of its critical infrastructure, especially the nuclear installations?
Well, first of all, in general, what we see and what could be good practices are first defining in a very clear way who is the organization or agency that should be responsible, because sometimes in countries it's not clear who that organization is. Sometimes there's more than one organization. The next step will be to define in a clear way what critical infrastructure is. In many countries, we see that they are still defining on the concept of defining. So although sometimes they have the sectors defined, but the organizations per se are not defined yet. So recommendation will be have a clear definition on what's critical, which sectors are critical, which depends from country to country. Then be capable of clearly naming those organizations. Then having, and of course, in this case, nuclear will be probably one of those sectors. All the countries that have nuclear capacity, that's of course absolutely critical. Then the next step is defining the assets. After you know who those organizations are, being capable of defining the assets. You can't imagine how challenging is, even sometimes for the company itself, to have the capability to define the critical, not only the critical assets, but the critical assets and even all the assets that they have. Because what we see around the world is that sometimes they are just monitoring specific critical assets, but then they forget to monitor all the assets of the organization. And as we know, sometimes they can compromise a specific asset and then do a lateral movement to what is critical. So I would say having the capability to define all the assets that belong to an organization and then what is critical. Eventually naming or having sectoral managers can also help. So we see that the countries that from my perspective are probably doing a better job are the ones that have defined sectoral managers, so people that will interact with the sectors. And in some cases, and this is probably also aligned with your question, but in some cases, highly sophisticated countries can have even an account manager, which is someone from the governmental agency that is sitting on the critical infrastructure. If it's absolutely critical, they will have someone. So this tells us that probably one day, if there is a crisis, they'll probably have the capability to better coordinate the response, right? Finally, having a clear policy around how the communication and what's the mandate of that agency and the CNIs, because in some countries we see that agencies can't do more because they don't have the mandate, and the frontiers are not clearly established or what they can and cannot do. I think that after defining all this, at the end, you need to make sure that what those governmental agencies can do when interacting with the constituents is clearly defined, and they have the mandate to do what needs to be done, which is not always the case. So I hope this has responded to your question, or at least gave some ideas.
Yeah, to some extent. We also had a question from the participant. It is a short question, but I'll be, adding one more follow-up question with it. One participant asked that which country in the 21st century is leading in the cybersecurity? And my follow-up question will be that Pakistan, being a latecomer in the domain of the cybersecurity, and along with numerous other developing countries, we're obviously following the suit of the technologically advanced countries. So it's better, we can have a better idea by, having a comparative analysis of the cybersecurity strategies of those technologically advanced countries. So first question is that which country is leading in the realm of the cybersecurity, and what should be the milestones which Pakistan should achieve in order to secure its national cyberspace and its critical infrastructures?
So the way we measure cybersecurity, and I'm going to respond probably from a different perspective. So I'm not going to respond in terms of the national legislation and national strategy. What we can see and we measure is how the countries are performing, both from a perspective of the companies and the citizens. So we measure things like, which at the end I think that are relevant, things like how many infections per habitant a country has, right? Because imagine a city where you have one thief per each 100 habitants and another one where you have 10. Where are you going to have more crime and homicide at the end of the year? It's pretty obvious that it's on the one that has 10, right? And we measure at scale, residential networks and corporate networks. What we see from that perspective, measuring things like the infections, the certificates, the way companies manage the firewalls. So what looking into the data, if you want, the response is not based on legislation, it's and training and capacity planning. My response will be based on the data, what the data tells, which in principle should be a consequence of the first things we've mentioned. So the legislations, the capacity planning, etc. In general, I'll tell you that in general, Europe as a continent is the one that is performing better. And then when you look into the countries, interestingly, the countries that are performing better are countries like, for instance, Germany. Some Nordic countries are also performing pretty well. Because we see, looking at all those risk vectors, they are the ones that have a better performance. But looking at all the country, which means, and because the residentials have a high impact when talking about the country because of their number, it means that in general, in those countries, they have probably a better posture when they are sitting in front of the computer. For instance, they will probably use better firewall systems. They will not do illegal activity like downloading torrents, right? Movies, applications, software. In general, companies will have a better posture in terms of measuring the certificates that they have. So when we measure all that, I would say that the Nordic countries and central countries of Europe in general are the best ones. Then in Asia, if we go into your continent, Japan is the number one. Japan is the number one. And when we look, I was not prepared to share all the data in more detail, but sometimes we share that information. But in general, in Asia, Japan is performing pretty well. After Japan, in general, comes Korea, South Korea. Interestingly, the way and the approach we have and the methodology, it can happen because since we look at all the attack surface, and in general, bigger countries will have more things exposed, it may happen that in some cases, countries that are not exposed to the world or open may also represent a good security posture. So interestingly, in our case, for instance, in Asia, North Korea also would have, let's say, from that perspective, will have a good rating because their exposure to the internet is very small. But those will be the outliers. So answering your question, north of Europe, Central Europe, Germany, Finland, Japan, those will be good examples at a national level. If we talk about taking off the citizens and focus on companies, the story can be slightly different. So there are some countries that will have a very good performance if we look at their companies, but their citizens are not performing at the same level. Now, in terms of milestones for Pakistan to get there and improve, I would say that first of all, I would recommend to try to do a diagnosis and understand where you are today, comparing with others in different risk vectors in different areas, so that you can measure in which areas Pakistan is behind. There'll be some areas where eventually you are in front of the, for instance, the average of Asia. Some other areas you will be behind. From our perspective, one way looking into data could be understanding in which areas Pakistan is not performing so well, and then eventually create a program in order to improve. And that program can be multiple things. Sometimes it's, some technical measures, sometimes can be an awareness campaign. For instance, one goal that I think that should exist, and I don't see that often, is how can I reduce the amount of infections going out from the IP addresses of my country. Also because I think many times countries do not have that notion. Countries typically know how many infections we had last year, how many we have this year, and they can see if the trend is going up or down. But in general, they don't have the capability to compare with others or do the same measurement with others. Because the moment you start doing that measure for the different areas, then you may have a good response to where you should start focusing, maybe on the areas where you are behind other countries that are similar to you. So this could be an interesting way, and then to establish some milestones of improvement instead of specifically in some areas, and then measuring it and doing the needed adjustments. So this could be one possible approach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Francisco Fonseca, for sharing your insight into the subject. Now we have another eminent speaker from the USA, Mr. Haris Khan, who is a senior executive at the Cybersecurity and Defense Consulting Group. His forte has been homeland security and counterterrorism, with a concentration on violent extremism, while he also studied the cybersecurity and terrorism about critical infrastructures. Today, he will be providing the policy orientation related to the cybersecurity of nation states, as he's an expert on South Asian and Gulf country affairs, and also have an experience of working in the joint interagency, defense, and diplomatic environments. So, Mr. Khan,
Okay.
A very warm welcome.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I just want to be upfront, be grateful and thankful for inviting me to this panel of esteemed speakers. Just need to clarify, during my undergrad and grad school, I did study a lot of issues regarding the critical infrastructure. And I will put the cybersecurity, try to put it in that context. And mostly my studies were critical infrastructure based in the United States, which comes under the Department of Homeland Security. So I'll start with that, and then I'll take an avenue towards Pakistan's critical infrastructure and the cyber threat. I just need to, if I may, the last question Mr. Siddiqui asked about, from Mr. Francisco regarding Pakistan's nuclear threat to Pakistan's nuclear status. If I can just, I've written a few papers on that, so I have a little bit of understanding of it. One needs to very clarify, define what is Pakistan's nuclear status. One is the power generation, and the other is weaponization. Now, if I could understand Mr. Ovas's question clearly, he was actually talking about the threat to the both of them. And the reason is,
exactly.
the reason is behind that Pakistan's about their three presently nuclear reactors, which are working, which are under the safeguard of NPT, which is the Canop in Karachi, south of Pakistan, and they're building Canop 2 and Canop 3. And then there's Chashma 1 and Chashma 2. These will eventually end up being 5 nuclear power plants. They come under the NPT treaty. So they're safeguarded. And for them to have an access for a IAE, and that's very clear for them. They can go in there, they can do inspections every time they want, and they want to ensure that the uranium is safeguarded over there. But the problem with the international community has been towards the unsafeguarded material, which comes out of Khushab 1, 2, and they're building the 1, 2, 3, and they're building the 4th one. That's the main problem over there. That's the weaponization material that comes out of there. And they're always looking for it. They want to always come in there and see what they're doing. And the access that, as far as I know, this is not it's having conversation with the scientists and people who are in charge over there, that they have a very good cyber apparatus over there for securing that they're, I mean, they do admit that they're there are several attacks that come on daily basis over there. And it comes from the east side of the border and comes from all over. And one of the actual person informed me, they actually come from the people who don't like the weaponization program over there, that countries of origin. So that was kind of, I just want to elaborate on that. It's a problem that comes from the way people ask the question. When they say the nuclear program, there's a default issue over here where both the weaponization program and the power generation, they're joined together. However, Pakistan keeps them very separate. And it is, you know, I've looked into it, I've talked to it, I've done good research on it. And it is commendable how Pakistan has kept the Canop 1 working and Chashma 1 and Chashma 2 working. I mean, they have never violated any treaty. There has never been any, you know, breakdown of security over there, being cyber or personnel. So this is just an assumption that there is some guy with a beard like me in a turban who's going through the weaponization program and getting all the secrets. There's just, you know, that's an assumption part of everywhere. It's a bias, so we have to live with it. Now, coming back to the critical infrastructure, after the tragic events of 9/11, the United States had, most of its critical infrastructures were under regulatory agencies, which were not, as President Bush once put it in a very mundane way, they were not, one hand was not talking to the other. So they built up the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Homeland Security, it is the second largest budgetary appropriation in the United States after the Department of Defense. I think Department of Defense budget is close to like $800 billion a year. And they are not behind, they're about $300 billion. And it covers about 17 agencies, start with FEMA, start with port security and other critical infrastructures. But the problem, the good thing about the United States and its critical infrastructure is they're very well designed and they're very well protected. And the policy that they actually institutionalize on them is very well defined. It's, you know, they have small points that they go through. I'll give you a issue, not that many people do it, understand, is that after the 9/11, they had actually put what they call fusion centers. And they're about 50, as far as I think 72 fusion centers, and other folks might, Ms. Dabbs probably know about it. All the information everywhere comes in there. And then gets decimated to other agencies. So they have a little bit of a bottleneck over there. They check on things. So they have a very good system. Nonetheless, it has faults in it. But if you take out the critical infrastructure away from that and go around the world, it has been a problem for the rest of the world since the beginning of warfare. The warfare meaning you go back times of Alexander the Great, the Romans and the Muslims invading, Arabs invading. The first thing they did was they went near a state, they went and poisoned the wells, they messed up the livestock. So they wanted to have a stranglehold on that adversary, real good. They want to create havoc over there. And critical infrastructure these days works exactly the same way. During World War II, the Americans, especially the Americans, the first thing they did to destroy the German Nazis' war machine, that they went and bombed Hamburg. And that is known as the worst bombing, aerial bombing in the history of mankind so far. They dropped more tonnage of bombs on Hamburg that was combined between the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. They wanted to level their infrastructure. Similarly, when they went and bombed what they call lightning of Tokyo, they did exactly the same thing. So this critical infrastructure has to be protected. And now we have come forward from mechanical aspects to cyber. And that is something that we should be very careful about. And giving you examples is what the first speaker, was it Mr. Rosenweig? He actually talked about it, that how the other countries, they try to hit United States, because United States is, everybody needs to understand, the richest country, they got a lot of resources, and you want to go and hit the biggest bear over there in the jungle. So that's why they come under United States. Now, let me go back and get into the issues of Pakistan and its critical infrastructure. Pakistan is one of those states which is actually called a national security state. Number one being the United States itself. It is a national security state. One needs to understand, it says in the Constitution, the preamble, common defense. And the common defense in the United States is the national security, internal and external. And Article 1 and 2, if you read them clearly, and if somebody needs to study them, they talk about the national defense. For the United States, national defense is paramount, and critical infrastructure comes underneath it. And that's the reason that when after 9/11, they came up with the Bush Doctrine, which was preemption. If they saw something, they're not going to go and negotiate. They're not going to go and talk and make things clear. They will go and destroy it and then talk about it. So the preemption issue was great. And that's why I asked the question, are there any preemptions? Which are? United States does preemption everywhere. It did in Iran during their, prior to the negotiation on nuclear deal, they did that over there, along with Israel. Israel is number 2 national security state. Since the creation of Israel, 1948, it is a national security state. It has in its constitution, and I think since 1949, they have a state of emergency over there. They can check on anyone. You go to, I don't know if anyone has gone to Israel. I have never been, but I've heard from even American diplomats from Department of Defense. They've gone to Israel and they're treated like a common criminal. They'll check on everything. They'll check on their cell phone. They want to go into their Gmail addresses, everything. And some of them have even returned that, I'm not going to go. If you have a conference, we can do a Zoom conference, but I'm not going to go there. So Israel is the number 2. There are other national security states, but Pakistan in general is a national security state. And once you declare yourself or build up on the premises that you are a national security state, then there's certain issues that go out of the window. And if I could relate to, there was a report that came out, and I think a few years ago, 2015, was by Privacy International, where it says the tipping and scale security and surveillance in Pakistan. It is about 60, 70 pages long. I can put a link over here. It actually talks about how Pakistan actually does surveillance on its own citizen, and how it is with impunity. In the United States, you want to do a surveillance, you have to get a court order. Israel doesn't have to do it. They just send the military over there, they'll take care of it. In Pakistan, they do it. And in that case, the famous, during the course, it doesn't matter if it's civilian or the military, they will do surveillance on you. And once they're doing surveillance, they compromise the issues related to national critical infrastructure. Recently, last month, there was a ransom hacker which went into K Electric. Probably Clay Electric, for those who don't know, is the main power electricity provider in Karachi. Yeah, in the largest city in Pakistan. It's about, some estimates say it's got 20 million people over there. They went there, and everybody knows they went there, but nobody knows what they got from there. And one actually person wrote on a tweet that they went there because K Electric gets power from Canop, the nuclear plant over there. They wanted to put a web over there to see what they're doing. It was a non-state actor, but they had figured out who it was.
We are, late on the time. So just a quick reminder that all the views shared by the speakers are their personal opinions and does not reflect the views of the Center of Pakistan and International Relations. So moving on to our next speaker, we have Mohammed bin Nasser with us. He's a national cybersecurity researcher. He is an innovative professional and pursuing his PhD degree in the cybersecurity with extensive experience in managing telecommunication and network engineering projects. He has proven success in administrating digital mobile radio networks and developing national cybersecurity framework for the unstable countries. He's a doctorate student from United Kingdom, and his focus of talk will be the capacity building for the national cybersecurity. So, Mr. Mohammed, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sadiqi, for introducing me. My name is Mohammed bin Nasser. I came from Libya. I'm doing a PhD, and recently I have graduated, and I have passed and get my PhD. And I'd like to share my research idea with you. I've done my research as a case study on my country. My country is Libya. I came from Libya, as I said, and I have been witnesses on many issues regarding security and cybersecurity in this country, and that's why I have chosen Libya as a case study. Libya is in transitional stage right now, politically unstable, so it has different issues and many issues related to cyber security. I have a small presentation I'd like to share it with you.
Yeah, sure, you can share it.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to give some introduction. What's capacity building? Capacity building is viewing as a mechanism to bridge the gap between poor governance or good governance and considering as a not suitable level of state capacity to deliver its main functions. Cybersecurity capacity building also viewing as the mechanism or transformation process connected to technological and political and social development were constantly growing these years. As you may, or all of you, seen what's happened in Arab Spring, what's happened with social media, how this affects the security and stability of these countries. Finding of my research, I found a lot of challenges regarding to these issues. For example, lack of stability toward this national solidarity and good governance, poor infrastructure in this country, organized crime and the terrorism group are being used as an instrument to committing international crime against other countries. Also, lack of national cybersecurity strategy, lack of awareness, and also this country, as an example of developing country, they are using digital financial services and they have been more targeted to cyber attacks and the lack of benefit from this digital service. Also, there are other issues like lack of funding support the cybersecurity activity or cybersecurity capacity. Also, we have lack of technical capacity and lack of human capitals. And also from my study, I have found that the existing frameworks, National Cybersecurity Framework or Maturity Cyber Capacity Framework, they are only or primarily focused on stable countries and mature countries. And so, however, these countries like my country, Libya, doesn't have the ability to improve their cybersecurity and how to use these frameworks to build their cybersecurity capability. So based on the literature review, I found that before I go to dimensions, I have studied many indexes to check what the challenges and to contextualize the problem space in Libya. And I have used the cybersecurity capacity maturity model from Oxford University to assess the situation in Libya. This framework built on 5 dimensions with strategy, culture, and education, and technical and legal aspects. So that's why I have chosen this framework to build to assess the situation in Libya and come up with framework to build the capability of cybersecurity in this country. I'd like to introduce my framework. It's like I have started, as I said, with the benchmark. I have used the Oxford capacity maturity model, and I have invited many stakeholders to see what are the challenges, and then I compared what existing from the other indexes, international existing, like a global cybersecurity index from from ITU, and then from after that, I asked the stakeholders to give me objectives how to solve this problem and how we come, to tackle the problem space in Libya, for example. And then after we get a lot of objectives, we transfer this idea to objectives to find the solution and to come up with another steps or mechanism to develop cybersecurity capacity in this country. For example, if we go to dimension 1, which is strategic capacity related to, for example, cybersecurity strategy, how to build cybersecurity strategy. First of all, we need cybersecurity authority, and then we need to build capacity for these people who was working in this cybersecurity authority, and also we need funding, we need political agreement to sign to make sure that cybersecurity is priority or necessary for the country. And after that, we need to build, for example, cybersecurity incident response, and also we need to build our military capability and many different things. This is in brief of my framework, and thank you. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Siddiq. You go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering what you feel at this point, given, the past decade, what Libya's greatest challenge will be for building out that cybersecurity program, if you had to name just like the foundational thing.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
I'm just asking, what do you think is going to be the most, I guess, the biggest roadblock to building out the cybersecurity program, if you had to choose one?
I think the most important thing is political will. We need to, from our political parties, to understand that cybersecurity issues is most important issues now for national security. We need to recognize that. After that, we can start building or develop like national cybersecurity strategy. We have to follow some specific guidelines. For example, cybersecurity strategy should be building on a risk-based approach. We need to understand what the threats to our national state, what our risks, what our vulnerability existing, what we need from awareness, what type of education. Also, I have noticed that most of experts from this country, they are travel to other countries looking for a job due to security issues. We need to solve security issues as well. So this is, I think, the most important step.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed.
Thank you,
So moving towards the end of our session, I must say that the idea of securing the cyberspace is gaining traction from the last decade, and there has been a tacit understanding of the cyber norms all over the globe. Government institutions, public-private partnerships, and the tech giants like Microsoft are calling for the digital Geneva Conventions. So it is a high time, especially for the developing countries like Pakistan, to work on its cybersecurity policy. So I would like to invite Ms. Amna Malik, the President of Center of Pakistan International Relations, to deliver her concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Wes, and thank you very much all the participants. I really appreciate and noted down all the recommendations. And inshallah, COPAIR is working on a comprehensive national cybersecurity strategy and policy, keeping in mind all the recommendations given by you and and our previous studies as well. And I think this is a very important subject for a developing country like Pakistan. And COPAIR always try to initiate different narratives for Pakistan. And this year, our basic work was related to that emerging technologies should be implemented in our national security policy. And artificial intelligence, we did a number of we work on number of events, and also we recommended it to the National Security Division, our policies and recommendations. Cybersecurity is also another very important perspective, because it is not only affecting the government and defense institutions, but it is also affecting our economy as well. And especially we come across Pakistan is having a middle class economy, and there are many SMEs which are really affecting by this cyber attacks. So it's not the issue of at the national level, but also at the individual level, people are facing difficulties. COPAIR also believe that cybersecurity is a very good business to do. And in universities and colleges, we initiated this cybersecurity program for the young students. And we arranged different training programs for them, and we gave them certifications. And we would like to collaborate with few of your organizations that how we can build up our cybersecurity scouts in Pakistan. We also worked with FIA. FIA is an organization which is working on cybersecurity in Pakistan. And then the former DG, additional DG of FIA, Amar Jafri, is also on board with us. So Pakistani government is realizing that this is something which is very important. And here we are gathering together because this is our third session related to cybersecurity and what kind of guidelines should be given by the worthy speakers, so that we finally we prepare a comprehensive cybersecurity policy recommendations for the policy advocates, that because this is very important. Ultimately, the policy will be adopted by the government at the national level. Then also the defense policy will also incorporate the cyber safety networks. So we studied Australia, we studied US, we studied Russia, China, and also our neighbor India, that how they are dealing with cyber and space. On 22nd of this month, I would like to invite all of you, if you have time, or please do spare some time. We are having another event in this series of webinars on cyber and space that is related to, the topic is future territories for national security and how cyber and space affect the future territories of the world. And it's and how it is important for Pakistan to have a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy and policy. Finally, I would like to thank all of you. We will also would like to share our recommendations and our research work with our worthy panelists. And we also request our worthy panelists that if you send us in writing few of your recommendations, it is highly appreciable. Anywhere, if you plan to visit Pakistan, you are welcome. I am a Pakistani empowered woman. You can see, so Pakistan is not a hub of terrorism activities. I grew up in this country, and I feel proud that I am a Pakistani. We need experience and information from the developed countries like US, China, and other countries, so that we should try to improve ourselves. And I believe that whenever our think tank recommended some policy to our government, they are always very, appreciating, and they try to come up with something new. That's why we are doing this humble effort. And finally, I again thank you, all of you, and especially I give credit to Wes, because this is he's the program head of this initiative, and I would like to work with you in future as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. So as ma'am concluded, the president of the Center of Pakistan International Relations, Ms. Amna Malik, already concluded the session, but I will say that your speeches are recorded and they will be uploaded at the YouTube and Facebook handles of the Center of Pakistan International Relations. You can also watch them, and I will share it with the panelists as well. A post-event report will be created in which all the recommendations will be incorporated, and they will also be shared with all of our worthy panelists. So as ma'am invited you, I would also like to ask you to please be part of our other event. It's at 22nd October, same time, 7 p.m. And I will be highly obliged by your presence. In the end, I would like to extend my gratitude to all the panelists and the participants on behalf of Center of Pakistan International Relations. And I hope to see you on our next event on 22nd October. Thank you very much, and Pakistan Zindabad.